Okay, guys, so today we're going to be talking about something called functional groups. So that's what you guys can title your lecture as. Now, you guys can see it's part 1, so we're going to do functional groups part 2 next time. And this is the thing that's going to be worth 25% of your grade on your final. So like I said, we're doing research. And even though, you guys get all the research right, you guys make a good poster. If you guys don't get the functional groups correct, then the best grade you can get on your final is going to be a 75%. So I know a lot of you guys are banking on the final to bump up your grade because it can a lot, but you got to know how to do functional groups. Just make sure you're following along and that you guys take notes, that you guys do the practice problems that we do today, okay? So let's jump into it. So you guys don't need to write down the definition of a functional group. A functional group is basically just a group of atoms that's in a molecule, and it kind of has their own little, their own characteristics and properties, okay? That's what a functional group is. So we're gonna be learning a couple of different types of functional groups. We're just gonna jump into the first one. So the first one is called an amine, and I want you guys do need to write the name down, okay? It's called amine, okay? Yeah, so I'll tell you guys which parts to write, but first start with the name. It's called amine. And the main part of an amine is a nitrogen, okay? So you guys should probably write this part down right here, draw this. But basically an amine is when a nitrogen is connected to an R. Now, R is not an element. R is basically just a bunch of carbons. So I'm gonna call it a carbon chain. And so when there's a nitrogen connected to different carbons, that's what we call an amine. Now, there's different ways that an amine can form. The first type of amine is one where a nitrogen is connected to 2 hydrogens and a carbon chain. Here we have an example of a nitrogen in the middle of a carbon chain. So this is kind of like this. If you have carbons, you got a nitrogen in the middle and it continues with a bunch of carbons. And then here you have an example where nitrogen has no hydrogens and it's in the middle of like a carbon triangle thing. So it's where a nitrogen is in the middle of a bunch of different carbon chains, okay? So there's 3 different types of amines. The key thing to note is that it's just a nitrogen connected to carbons. And you guys do not need to memorize this. I have a chart for you guys where this is all here, but you do need to know how to read the chart. So that's what I'm going over now. Okay, and your guys' favorite chemical, this is methamphetamine. And this one contains an amine right here, okay, where the nitrogen, if you guys notice, is connected to a carbon here and a carbon here. So it's basically like this one right here. Okay. So that's what an amine is. Basically a nitrogen in the middle of a carbon chain. Any questions about an amine? So again, you guys don't need to copy all this down, just know the general way to understand what these structures mean. Okay. So what you're going to be doing on your final and your assignments for today and next time is you're going to get molecules like this, and you're going to have to basically tell me what functional groups are inside of it. So if one of you studies meth for your final project, you would say, hey, there's an amine right here in the structure. Okay, so that's what we're going over. Okay, let's go on to the second one. The second one is super easy. It's an alcohol, okay? And so I know we think of alcohol as, alcoholic drinks, but alcohols are a type of chemicals, and it's basically where you have, I guess, OH, connected to a carbon chain, okay? Where you have your teacher connected to carbon chain. So we have 2 different types of alcohols right here. We got ethanol. This is the stuff in alcoholic drinks that makes you drunk. You got OH connected to a carbon, which is connected to another carbon. Okay. So that's what an alcohol looks like. This would be the alcohol. Thank you. Just think about me. Okay. I don't promote drinking though, so. Okay, anyway. This one right here has an alcohol group right here. So if you look at this chemical, there's an alcohol. And then we have this nitrogen thing right here. What do we call this one? Yeah, an amine. Same thing as the one that we went over last time. So you can have multiple functional groups in the same molecule. And that's what you'll most likely get for your research project, because you'll be looking at kind of bigger chemicals. And so there will be multiple functional groups in the same compound. Okay. Easy peasy. All right, let's move on to the next one. And don't feel stressed to copy all of this down. Again, I do have a chart for you guys. The important thing is that you guys know how to read the chart, because the chart's just going to contain this general structure. All right, the next one is called an ether. Okay, and ethers are where you have an oxygen in the middle of a carbon chain. So R means carbon chain. R and then this apostrophe means a different carbon chain. So if you have a bunch of carbons in a row, and then you got an oxygen in the middle of it, and then it keeps going, that's what an ether is. Okay. And then here we have another chemical you guys might be interested in, MDMA, also known as ecstasy. It has an ether right here, and it has an ether right here. Because if you notice, this oxygen is connected to a carbon here and here, and this oxygen is connected to a carbon here and here. Do you guys see any other functional groups inside of ecstasy? One that we just talked about? Yeah, on this side, on the right side. They're so shy today. Yes, an amine. Sorry, I'm hard of hearing. Yeah, so we got an amine right here, and then we got two ethers right here. All right, so far so good. We got a couple more, and then we're almost done. Okay, the next one is called a carbon ring, and I have a bunch of different carbon rings right here, but basically a carbon ring is a closed shape made of only carbons. Okay, only carbons. Okay, so we have a couple examples. And so if you look at this right here, it only has carbons, it only has those little corners. If you look at this compound right here, there's a closed shape right here, this triangle. It's made out of only carbons. We have an amine right here, but it's okay. We still have a carbon ring right here. You can have multiple. There's double bonds inside of this closed shape, but it's still all corners. So this is a carbon ring. And here we have two carbon rings. Okay, there's one ring right here, one ring right here. Okay, now this one right here is not a carbon ring because if you notice, it's a closed shape, but one of the corners is not carbon, it's oxygen, right? So instead, this is going to be an ether. This is not a carbon ring because it's a closed shape, but it's not all carbons in that closed shape. Okay, so just make sure you guys keep that in mind. Yes, whatever it is, stop. No, you're good. I couldn't hear what was going on. But yes, please stop. All right, any questions about carbon ring? All righty, let's move on to the last group of stuff. Now, sometimes you're gonna get chemicals where there is there's like no functional groups. Okay, and so when we have stuff that has no functional groups, we have to just look at the bonds that are in it. So the first one are alkanes, and alkanes are chemicals that basically only have single carbon to carbon bonds. Okay. Okay, so if you look at this compound right here, there's like nothing there. It's just a bunch of single bonds between carbons. So we would call this an alkane. But this guy right here, there's single bonds between carbons. But since we have another functional group, we're not going to call it an alkane. We call that an alcohol. Okay, so if there's nothing better, if there's no functional groups other than like single bonds, that's called an alkane. Okay, but if there are other functional groups in there, we have to identify it based on the other functional group, okay? Okay, so we talked about single bonds here, so that means naturally the next thing we're going to talk about are double bonds. And so when you see a double bond inside a compound that has no other functional groups, like this one right here, we call that an alkene. Okay, so the one that we just talked about earlier are alkanes, right? K-A-N-E. And that's going to be if you have single bonds, single carbon to carbon bonds. And so alkenes are where you have a double bond between two carbons. Okay. And so again, we only use alkane and alkenes if there's nothing better to use. If you look at this example right here, we have an amine right here. And so this is not an alkene. This is an amine. Okay, because there's a different functional group. We only use alkanes and alkenes if there's nothing better to use. All right. All right, and so you guys can kind of probably predict what's next, and this is the last one for today. If there's nothing better and there's a triple bond, we call that an alkyne. Okay, so alkane, kene, kyne. And this one is going to be a triple bond between two carbons. And again, we only use these three if there's nothing better. So here on the left side, we have an alkyne because the only real interesting thing we have is a triple bond between two carbons. But here we have a ether, right? We have an oxygen in the middle, so we wouldn't call this an alkyne. And that's it. So those are the functional groups that we're going to go over today. The next time that we meet, we're going to go over a couple more. But what you're going to be doing is using the functional groups that we learned today to identify what functional groups are in bigger molecules. And that's ultimately what you're going to be a big part of your final. So we're going to do a couple practice problems before I get you guys started on your assignment. But to kind of help you guys out and save a little time, I'm going to go over the first couple problems on your assignment, okay? And so that way you can just naturally go into the rest of it. So if you guys want to go to a new page, and this will be like number 1 and number 2 on your assignment, you guys can do that. And while you guys do that, I will leave this up here for a bit. But any questions on these groups? Yes. Yeah, so you only use kane, kene, and kyne if there's nothing else to do. Exactly. All right, let's go to your assignment. We're gonna do number 1 and we'll go over this one right here, the example, and then we'll go over number 1 and 2, okay? So if you look at this example, I gave you the answers. So what I want you guys to do is take about maybe a minute to figure out where these 3 groups are. I gave you the answer here already, but let's see if you guys can figure out where in this molecule each of these functional groups are. So take about a minute. You can work with the person next to you. You guys don't need to copy this down, but see if you guys can figure out where the ether is, where the alcohol is, and where the amine is. Okay, so I'll give you a minute to try that, and then we'll go over that. Alrighty, guys, let's see if you guys were able to figure that out. So let's start with the ether. Okay, so the ether is going to be right here in the very middle. Okay, because it's an oxygen in the middle of this carbon chain. So this is going to be your ether. Okay, your alcohol, again, just look for me, and then you'll find your alcohol, OH. And then lastly, your amine is going to be right here. You got the nitrogen connected to a carbon chain right here. So that's where your 3 functional groups are. Any questions? Hopefully it's not too bad. Okay, let's do number 1 and number 2 together on your assignment, and then after that, yeah, what's up? For your assignment? Yeah, you can just write the functional groups that there are. Yeah. Okay, so let's do number 1 and 2 together, and then I'll get you guys started on your assignment. So if you guys take a look at number 1, anybody see a functional group here? Yeah. Yeah, you see an alcohol. Alcohol, just look for me right here, and there's an alcohol. So there's 1 alcohol. So that's how you would solve that one. Do you guys see any other functional groups? Okay, no, because there's single bonds between carbons, but since the alcohol is there, we don't really have to write alkane or anything like that. Okay, let's go to number 2. What's the functional group that you guys see on number 2? Yeah, we see an amine right here. We got the nitrogen connected to a carbon, And so all you would have to write is 1 of each. Okay, so pretty easy, not too bad. Okay, so I'll give you guys the rest of the class period to work on the rest of this assignment. If you guys got any questions, let me know. I have physical copies of the functional groups that we learned today up here if you want to refer back to the chart that I have, so you can pick that up if you want. But I'll give you the rest of the class period to work on it, and I have to answer if you want to check your answers.